Brady, welcome to Adulting with Autism.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, for my squad who is new to you, I want you to tell them all about you and how you came up with when autistic kids grow up, because that's the whole center of this podcast.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm a journalist by training. I studied biology, and then I got a master's in journalism, and I've been doing science journalism for a long time now. I mean, decades. And I covered biotechnology for a long time, and then I joined this group here called the Transmitter, where we cover research into autism and neuroscience in general. And it was through our normal news gathering process where we have a bunch of reporters on the team. I'm an editor here, and the reporters will bring in things that they've seen, new papers, press releases, information they've gleaned from sources, just story ideas in general that they think might be useful for our coverage. And we came across a paper called, it's sort of paraphrased, Mind the NIH Funding Gap. And it was written by a researcher at Vanderbilt University, and her name was T.A. Meridian MacDonald, or Tempest Alexandria Meridian MacDonald. And there's a co-author on the paper as well. And the paper basically said um, that they had done an analysis of the NIH funding, grants that were given out to study autism research, and they could find hardly anything that was associated with funding for researching into the lives of autistic adults. And they said that the NIH is discriminating against autistic adults, and the things that they are funding is actually eugenics, right? And so those are pretty inflammatory statements to make.
Right.
And so the paper had caught the attention of our news gathering crew, and we brought it up in a news meeting. And I looked at the paper and I realized that I had met this researcher. I had been at a conference, the INSAR conference, and I was pretty new to the field. And I sat down at a table, and she sat down next to me and we started talking. She lived in Atlanta. I had lived in Atlanta for a while, and we were talking about that. And she told me that she was working on a paper about something pretty big, she said, about discrimination at the NIH. And that's all she wanted to say about it. And I said, well, if that's true, we'd be interested in hearing that, because that sounds like an interesting story, right? And so I was like, that's that person. This is her paper, and that is that person. So I said, let's see what we can figure out. And I called her and said, hey, we came across your paper, and we're wondering if maybe we want to do some sort of story on this. And we didn't really know what it was going to be at the time. And she said she was kind of like, well, she definitely wanted media coverage, right? Because she wrote the paper to get attention. And she's like, okay. And she wasn't sure. And we talked more. And she said, okay, let's see what maybe you can do. Let me know what you're thinking about doing. And so in our own team here at the Transmitter, we talked about what kind of story we could do. And it just seemed like, well, first off, we began to ask people, other researchers in the field, and we said, what do you think about this paper? Have you seen this paper? Do you think that there's discrimination at the NIH? What do you think is happening there? And they said, well, the analysis is a little flawed, as they admit in the paper, April, themselves. They say, well,
Right.
we didn't look at the number of grants that were applied. So we don't know what people are trying to get funded. We only know what's come out the other side.
Right.
So it'd be hard to say that like 100 grants came in, were applied for, with people trying to get funding for research in autistic adults, and the NIH said no to all of them. They don't know anything like that. So it's hard to make the claim that there is being discrimination against all these researchers. But they all kind of said, yeah, but there's almost no funding for research into autistic adults, right?
Right.
And they said, and if you look at like IAC, for instance, I mean they've been saying this every time they put out a report,
Yeah.
right? They say, go ahead.
Well, you're not wrong, because when my son came out of school, I'm an occupational therapist by training, and I tried looking for papers on autistic young adults, and I found zero.
I mean, not only young adults, but older, 40, 50, 60-year-olds, right? I mean, there's just almost no research. And I mean, so anyway, we'll get back to that. So we asked around, and they said, well, we don't know about discrimination. We don't know about eugenics, but yes, there's a problem. And it became clear that her paper was definitely pointing to a problem. And she'd written a paper to try to like bring some air to this. But yes, the amount of money that is spent on research into autistic children is far, far, far greater than anything that looks at adults. And as we know, children grow up and become adults. So all these people that they're studying so diligently as youth, I mean, they're becoming adults and nobody's really looking at what their lives are like. What can be done to better their lives? What do we know about what Alzheimer's looks like in an autistic person versus a neurotypical person, right? Yeah, I can see you raising your hands. Yeah, I mean, these questions are important. So if you are autistic, or you bring your child or a loved one to a healthcare provider, and they say, I think maybe this person has dementia, and they say, well, they're also autistic. How do we figure that? Nobody knows because the research hasn't been done, right? So this became clear, and we thought, all right, well, maybe there's a good story we can tell about this researcher and her attempts to try to highlight this problem. And that's what the podcast is about. She herself is autistic. She has an autistic son who's now an adult. Her father doesn't have a diagnosis, but he was kind of a late speaker, and he thinks he has some traits in there. He said I was probably neurodivergent, as he says that in the podcast. So it's really looking at a bunch of these adults and her life as a researcher, and then what might be done about this problem, what other people think is going on with this problem, this disparity in funding. And that's how we started it. And then, just spent a couple of years talking to her and interviewing people and going to see her and visiting her son, interviewing her son, her father, and putting the podcast together.
This is freaking amazing because I was like, no one's doing this. No one? Is it just me? Oh, okay.
It's not just you. Yeah.
So now that we're out here and she's pointing the arrow to this big gap because it's a huge gap. How can we start this funding? Because yes, there's tons about kids, but then when it's like they hit 18 and then you have nothing and they keep growing with all these other problems. And I'm like, which I've encountered in long-term care where people are like, oh, they're difficult. I was like, no, they're autistic, but then
Yeah.
they have dementia.
Yeah.
That's a whole new ball game.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the question of how to shift the funding or find new sources of funding to look at adults, that's I don't know. That's a government issue, right? But what we can do, or what we're trying to do anyway with the podcast, is raise the issue. Because if you don't raise the issue, no one's going to know. And plenty of people know. I mean, once you start asking around, you'll hear people say, no, I tried to get grants on this and I couldn't find a way to fit it in the NIH, or my grants weren't approved. It's almost as the idea isn't that well known, even maybe within the NIH, that this is an issue. So there has to be a way to raise the issue, the consciousness, that people are like, okay, we need to study this and there needs to be funding for it. And the grant should probably look at these 4, 5, 6 important things, and we'll spread it out over time. So I mean, for as far as we're concerned, it's just getting the idea out there. I mean, she pointed to something important. We talked to lots of other people who agreed, and now we're trying to surface the idea. And that's what journalism, maybe does best. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, because
I hope.
I had no idea because I thought, am I the only one? I feel like a crazy person? And no, it's really there.
That's funny that you said that, because the researcher who wrote the paper, she was going on about what she'd found. She's like, I don't like this. I can't find the thing. This is all in the podcast, by the way. I'm not finding ways into the NIH. I can't win grants. I feel like there's something going on here. There's something wrong here. Is it just me? And people were saying you should think about your grantsmanship. They say your grantspersonship, the way you apply for your grants. You should consider maybe changing that a little bit, or thinking about different pillars within the NIH. You could send your applications to, your grant applications. But she had that same feeling that you're just describing. It's like, am I the only one that sees this? Is it just me? Am I the only one that's thinking about this? And the answer is no. When you start to really look around, you're not the only one.
It's just the NIH has yet to have these researchers get their research out there.
Yeah, it's like I was talking to one person, and they're also in the podcast. She said, well, we know why there's a focus on children, right? I mean, Leo Kanno first diagnosed autism in children. Obviously, we've learned a lot about the benefits of early intervention. It first manifests in children. That's when it's first realized. So immediately, the healthcare system and the research system just sort of looked at children for that reason. And I think there's been a lot of benefits to that. I mean, we know way more now than we did 50 years ago. What are the causes? What are the best ways to help these people thrive? Everything like that. But it has yet to shift. All those children grew up and became adults, right? That's what happens. And it is yet to shift so that the field of research follows them into adulthood. and says, okay, what can we learn about their lives in adulthood? What can we learn about comorbidities, for instance? What can we learn about lifespan? There's this really interesting paper. It came out in 2016, I think, and it was in the writers had looked at two registers in Sweden. One was the National Patient Register, and one was the Death Register in Sweden. And it had something like 27,000 autistic people, and then 2.7 million roughly controls. And they looked at when these people died. They compared them. They compared them across gender, their county of residence, and age. And it showed that autistic people, on average, die 16 years earlier than a neurotypical person. That's a huge disparity.
Huge.
Huge, right? It's and they broke it into two groups. They called it what do they use? Yeah, high performing. Let's see. I think I wrote it down. Yeah, high functioning groups and low functioning groups. That's what they use in the paper. And low functioning, they died even earlier. But even if you throw the high functioning groups in, 16 years difference in health. And if there's some other health disparity in the country, if we know cancer, we know any health condition, and people were dying 16 years earlier on average, there'd be a huge amount of focus on it. And there isn't on autistic adults. They go, that's just part of autism, right? That's just part of autism. Yeah, I can see your face. Like having your brain wired a little differently is not a cause to die earlier. So there's something else going on and they don't know what it is. And that's the kind of research that needs to be funded.
Because my other question is what about all the adults that are late diagnosed now just getting the diagnosis and they have those comorbidities and they're like, well, how do I function with this and this? And what does this mean?
Yeah. I mean, you'd have to tell me. They go to the doctor and say, these things are going on. What do you think? And usually I think the doctor says, I don't know, because the research hasn't been done yet. I don't know that, April. I mean, that's because I'm not autistic myself. I have not been through that situation. But I've had people tell me that the healthcare system just isn't prepared to answer those questions because the research isn't there to supply the answer yet.
No, and I can attest to that. My son is autistic with spina bifida and hydrocephalus.
Yep.
So not only is he learning to manage his autism, he's got to learn how to manage his physical ability to function.
I mean, are there
Um,
other things? Are there sleep issues,
oh, yes. All of
GI
it.
issues?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's all in there. And why? Why? What's the link, right? And there's some papers that suggest it, and some people that definitely show the correlation. But yeah, more work needs to be done.
So what was like hardest for you to sit with as you were editing after the interview? Because I can't imagine just sitting there and you're like, am I in 2026?
You mean about the which part? You mean about like the healthcare disparities or
Both.
all of it? I mean, so part of the podcast is looking at this researcher's life. She's had an amazing life. She really lived on the edge for a while. I mean, she was homeless for a little bit as a teenager in Atlanta. I think that's very dangerous. I think I'm surprised something worse didn't happen to her. I just almost feel super proud of her for making it through and earning a PhD. She didn't go to college until she was 28 and she got a PhD. I mean, she really kicked her way to the top. And we had to think a lot about how much of that we wanted to put in the podcast and how much was, too personal to put in there, right? Because it's really her personal story. And it's an inspiring story, honestly. You meet some people and you're like, yeah, they make sense that they're a success. They've had support, they've had money, they've had these things. And other people, you're like, wow, I'm super impressed that they were able to do it. And she's one of those, one of the second. I'm really impressed with her. So I had to think a lot about editing, how we're going to tell that story, and also, back and forth with her. She knows everything that's going to be in it. She hasn't heard it yet. It's launching on Thursday, but she knows what's in it, so that she's not going to be surprised at the details that we've included. We've asked, is it okay that we say this? Yes, it's okay. Is it okay that we use your son's voice? Yes, it's okay. Does your father know that we're using his voice? Yes, it's okay. So that was kind of something we had to work through. As far as the rest, like, the healthcare disparity and the funding, I mean, again, it's like we just had to go get as much information as we could from other sources who are experts in the area, right? I mean, I'm just a journalist. They actually are researchers. They're actually looking at funding constantly. They're advocacy groups. That's what they do for their life. And We heard sort of had to dig that out, and once that was built, I said, yeah, they've really laid out a convincing argument. It was easier to put together from that point on.
So, what role do you think podcasts, newsletters, online communities like mine can help in shifting that whole ordeal?
Yeah, that's a super good question, because when I was talking to this one researcher, and she's been trying to work. She has been working and trying to work with autistic adults for a while, but as we just said, it's hard to get funding. And she was one of the groups that just got funding. Do you remember when the Trump administration said we're going to fund these 13 projects?
Yes.
We're going to fund these 13 projects in autism, and all of them were basically looking at kids except one. And she's the one. She was the one that is looking at adults. So I was talking to her about, like, okay, you've got this money, you've got this funding coming in. What's it been like to try to earn money before this? Not earn, win grants before this. And she said, it's been really difficult. And she said, it's almost like we need like a public awareness campaign to raise this issue, right? So that's what I think journalism and podcasts can do, is say, hey, if you guys aren't aware, here's a problem. And here's why it's a problem. What can be done about it? I mean, that's really up to the policymakers to decide what can be done about it, but they have to know there's a problem first. And I think podcasts are great for that.
It makes me want to, like, usually I don't write papers. It's not my thing, but it makes me want to write my AOTA and say, we have a problem, therapist. We are
Yeah.
missing a big gap
Yeah.
and we could be a part of the solution.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the way to do that is, I mean, I can send you that paper, that Swedish paper about the health disparity.
Yes, that'd be great.
You just take that and say, look at this. Why is 16 years? This is a big deal. 16 years. Why is this happening? We need to know why this is happening.
So, was there a moment like in her story where you thought if she wasn't autistic, would this have gone differently?
What part? You
About
mean,
like doing the research and getting approved for research?
I think, no, not the part about getting the grants. I don't think that was part of it. I think the way the NIH is currently structured, the way she was trying to place her grants, there wasn't a perfect home for it. And lots of people said that. So I don't think that had anything to do. But what I do think was important is, I don't think that if she hadn't had the lived experience that she had, and she didn't have the son that she had, that she would have been so focused on the topic. It was speaking to her because it was part of her life. And I think that's the key to having, like, diversity in any part of research or government, whatever. She had a viewpoint that not everybody had. And I think that viewpoint is the thing that really keyed her in on the topic and made her kind of like extra urgent about it. And that fueled the paper. Yeah.
Did she ever talk about masking or trying to pass in like academic spaces and how that intersected with everything else?
Not not masking per se, but we did talk about, how I mentioned that she didn't go to college until she was 28. So she was in Atlanta and she went across the country to California and went to a community college at 28. And from there she transferred to another university and got a degree, and then she transferred into the PhD program at Madison. And she said when she got to Madison, there are a lot of people in the PhD programs, and they'd come from Johns Hopkins, and they'd come from Emory, they'd come from these really good universities. And she's like, well, I came from this community college. And she said that made her feel, like a little bit like an outsider. Like, I have to, maybe they don't think I belong here. She had some maybe imposter syndrome, where she eventually settled in and she found her mentors and did great work. But yeah, not masking so much, but that part of being like, I'm coming from the outside into this sort of, the ivory tower of academia, that made her feel different. Yeah.
So, when you were interviewing her and she was like writing this paper trying to alert all other researchers and educators, did she say like, was her big push just her son? Or did she find out she was autistic later, like a lot of us, and then was like, aha, that ding. And that's what kicked her off?
No, I think so. I mean, she did not get a diagnosis at like 2 years old, like happens today. Her son did at age, I think, 2. He really didn't have much language yet, and the pediatrician was like, something's going on. Let's see if he can be diagnosed for autism, and he met the criteria. So for her, I think it was more like a realization later in life. her mom has a autism diagnosis. It's in her family for sure. And she realized that she had certain ways of seeing the world, certain ways of interacting. She had social issues in school. She wasn't quite sure how to handle social issues. She talked about that a lot. Um, but I think for the paper, the reason she wanted to write the paper wasn't just for her son. I mean, that's part of it, of course, but it was just in general. Like in general, she wanted to kind of like take up for this group, autistic adults. Her son was an adult by then, but in general, she wanted to look at like this group needs help, and I want to try to help this group.
Now, as you were writing as a non-autistic journalist, how did you keep it like even keel and not turning Tempest into some inspirational saving the world or a tragic hero?
Yeah. Well, first off, I was inspired by it, though. That's true. I mean, as I said, she's had a life that if I was in her situations, I don't know if I would have done as well as she did. I really believe that. So I do find it inspiring, but just in general, like anytime you're writing, I don't think you should write a hero. Heroes are actually not kind of real, right? They're in comic books. Even your greatest people are flawed in some ways, and she's aware of her own flaws. She can get really focused on an issue. She can be very forthright in the way she describes things or has opinions. She can get very opinionated. She knows all that. So I just try to put the realities of her life together and just let it speak for itself. She's a good-hearted person with good intentions, and she has flaws like all of us. So I just try to include all that.
So the podcast hasn't come out yet, right? When's the podcast coming out?
So Thursday, June 4th is the first episode, and there are 5 episodes. So every Thursday after that, for the next following 4, there'll be an episode that launches live. And the way you can find it, you can go to our website, we'rethetransmitter.org. It'll be there. But you can also just search When Autistic Kids Grow Up in any podcast app, and you'll find it. You can follow it, and then just shows up in your phone from that.
I'll be putting this on my to-do calendar. Make sure my kid listens to this because he
Good.
feels the same way. He's 24. He's like, why can't I get help? And I was like,
Yep.
I can't tell you. I don't understand.
I'd be interested in what he thinks about it when he's listened.
I, me too, because he's very opinionated and very justice seeking. So I was like, you need to tone that down, son. You don't need to be kicked out of college just yet.
Right. Wait till you're graduated and then be
Right.
opinionated. Yeah.
What do you hope listeners ask themselves when they hear her story?
There's a couple things that struck me. This is also in the podcast, but when she was like 16 and she didn't have a place to sleep, and so she got really into pool. She became a really good pool player, and she would hang around bars all night, learning pool and playing pool because it was safe. It was a safe place for her, right? There were people around. The bars were open late. And she would sometimes she needed food, and sometimes people would buy her a sandwich and stuff, but she could never let anybody get really close to her because you can't know that she didn't have a place to go. She'd be exposed and that'd be very dangerous, right? And she sort of talked about that, and I thought, I feel like I've met that person. I feel like I've met that person before in some bar or something where they want something from you, but you don't know what it is, and they won't quite tell you what it is. And I just think that I just felt like there's a lot of people like her in the world. And I don't even mean autistic. I mean, people who have had to really work hard to get where they are. And I wanted to put that in audio. I think that should open some people's eyes to humanize everybody that they meet. That's one. 2 is I think that people should know about the huge disparity in funding. And that's not, again, it's not to say we shouldn't be looking at autistic children. We should, but we also need to look at adults. All those kids have grown up when autistic kids grow up, right? And we need to know what's going on with their health as well. And I think that's an issue that really needs to be raised in the community.
Is there like a moment or a quote or sound from the series that you hope watch in people's brains and refuse to leave?
Well, I've listened to the audio so many times now that there's a bunch, right? I can hear it over and over just through the process of editing it. I don't think I have a direct quote. There's a story in there, which is my favorite story of the whole thing. So she was born in Alaska.
Wow.
Yeah. Her dad had gone to Alaska to homestead with his wife and her older half brother. She wasn't born yet. And then she was born there. But that first year, her dad is a real interesting person as well. So he loves the homestead. He loves to camp out. He's happy to be off the grid. He'll, no running water, that's fine. He'll set up solar, that's fine. He's totally happy he's a real survivalist like that. He's very talented in that way. And he was going to do that in Alaska, but they got there late and they were not prepared. He was from Atlanta. He didn't really know what winter was going to be like. And they rented this cabin way out in the woods with no power and no electricity. And he's like, we nearly died. We nearly froze to death. They didn't have food, no water, and no electricity. And in that month of January, I think the average temperature for January was like -20. That stuck with me forever, right? And she was born there in Alaska, and they moved back to the lower 48 about a year or two after that, I think. But that story, I was like, okay, this is a person whose parents were a little bit like a little naive about the problem ahead of them, right? A little naive, but still real survivors. And I think she's a real survivor too.
Brady, where can people find you, or if they want to know more about when autistic kids grow up, if they have their own questions?
Yeah. So, we are called The Transmitter. So you can find us at thetransmitter.org, TheTransmitter.org. And on that page, there's a link to who we are, all of us, journalists. And I'm on there, and our contact information is on there. You can find me there for sure.
Brady, thank you so much for coming on to my podcast.
I loved it. You asked great questions.